Hello and welcome everyone for another episode here at CIO Talk with Riaz. This is Riaz Yusuf. I'm a Chief Information Officer and your host. I'm excited to have with us today Mike Pfeiffer, who's the founder at Cyber5. I'm looking forward to discuss with Mike about cybersecurity in particular. So without any further ado, welcome Mike. Could you please briefly introduce yourself for my audience?
Awesome. Thanks, Riaz. Yes, my name is Mike Pfeiffer. I am the founder of Cyber5. We're a cybersecurity coaching firm, if you will. We help businesses and consumers understand their cybersecurity risks, how they might best address them. Sometimes do that through a scorecarding process, um, mainly to try to keep them safe from the bad actors out there. So there's more and more activity all the time online, and the bad actors are, moving from large businesses down to small businesses and even consumers as those large businesses harden themselves. So the other thing, I'm also the mayor of the town that I live in. So I'm in a little bitty town called Long Beach, Minnesota. We're west central Minnesota, a couple hours outside of the Twin Cities, and I've been be finishing up my third 2-year term as mayor, and I've been involved with the city for 10 years. Actually had an opportunity to harden the city prior to COVID and the pandemic that happened. So we were able to do some digital transformation there and worked out really well for the city. And I'm also pretty big into volunteering. So I'm soon to be involved with the leadership of our local United Way. I'm a board member now, and I'll be moving into executive leadership with them. And just in general, I work with the Rotary here in town and a lot of volunteer activities in the small town Minnesota. So I've been
Wonderful,
involved.
Mike.
My background, Riaz, is 36 years in IT, from IT director. Most recently, I was the CIO or the VP of technology at American Solutions for Business here in Glenwood. American is a $400 million print and promo distributorship, and with over 1,000 employees. Worked with them for 11 years, starting out from really simply having a help desk, if you will, and not really much of a cyber presence at all the way to developing that and hardening it all the way up to the point now that they've got managed services and a team. When I started, there was 20 folks in the IT area, and when I finished, we'd grown with the organization from 150 million in revenue to 400 million, and the team had grown from 20 to 60 folks. So
Wonderful. That's amazing, Mike. I didn't know that you are the mayor for Long Beach, Minnesota. I lived in the northwestern suburbs of Minneapolis for 12
okay.
years, actually. I've been to Long Beach. There is a big lake in Long Beach, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Yes, you bet. Lake Minnewaska, we're nestled on the shores between Lake Minnewaska and Pelican Lake, so two lakes here in Long Beach.
Pretty sure I've been there.
And
It's
yeah,
great.
we're a vacation land, so a lot of folks that are in the Twin Cities love to come up and see us in the summer months, and more now as the pandemic has moved work from an office to remote, we've seen a lot of folks migrating up this way as well. 2 months before the pandemic, our county was able to complete a fiber to the home initiative. So all of the area of Pope County now, which is what we're in west central Minnesota, we've got gigabit fiber to our homes. So it really made working from home very attractive. We saw a lot of folks that were in the suburban area and driving to downtown. Their businesses went remote, so they were now in the suburbs and working in from home. And they realized, well, why don't I sell my suburban house and buy a house up in
Yeah.
where I vacation and had fiber. And so that's really, we've seen a lot of growth in that area. And I will say that this spring as well, it seems as interest rates have come down a little bit, it's really loosened up the housing market. So we're seeing a lot more sales. I've seen probably 4 or 5 in our little city this month already. So I think it's heating up a little bit, which is nice.
That's great. You being the mayor of the city with the technology background, I'm sure you'll do everything in your power to modernize your city with all sorts of technology, including a fiber internet. That's great. That's great.
Yeah, well, and
Mike,
it's kind of, oh, go ahead.
no, go ahead. You finish it off.
I was going to say it was kind of interesting because when I moved to Long Beach in 2013, when I was working for American, and I'm one of those weird guys that gets the ballot, the election ballot every year before you go in to vote in 2014, and I noticed that Long Beach had a mayor and two council members that were up for election, and but yet nobody was running. They were open positions. So I contacted our mayor, which was at the time was my neighbor, and I said, "Well, what's the deal?" And he said, "Well, people just write us in, and we'll go from there, and we don't really have somebody to take over one of the council positions." So I said, "Well, I'll help serve." And so I figured at the time we didn't have a website, we didn't have email, there was no way to contact the city. Everything was working on personal emails. And I thought, well, it's perfect. I'll go and I'll help out with the city. And so I did a write-in campaign, got elected with 20 folks
That's interesting.
supporting me.
That's not too long ago. It's only about 10 years ago. They did not
Yep,
have email access. That's very interesting.
you bet. Well, and that was the thing. So then I got to the first meeting and I thought, okay, well, I'm the IT guy. I'm here to help. And they all looked at me cross-eyed and they said, well, you're replacing Jerry, and Jerry was the sewer guy, so you're going to do sewer. And so I spent 2 years doing sewer,
I
and got
see.
that figured out. Well, with my IT background, that's pretty adjacent to sewer. A lot of, we're dealing with a lot of
Cleanups.
those issues, if you will. And then after that, 2016, worked on digital transformation, and we got our email all set up, got a website presence, moved to electronic file systems, and got all that in place prior to the 2020 pandemic. So it really worked out well for our city because we were able to, a lot of smaller cities had to stop meeting and didn't really have an electronic presence, and we already had that figured out. So that's been interesting also, Riaz, just to see different attack vectors coming in from municipal areas, right? Cities, states, counties are pretty big targets. So I've had exposure to that side of things, and just get a different picture, rather than the commercial side of an IT organization for a business. So that's been an interesting journey as well. And I'll be running again this year for my fourth consecutive term. So.
That's very impressive, Mike. Thank you. Thank you for everything you're doing. Um, so going back to your corporate career, the history that you briefly mentioned about, based on that, it sounds like you had a successful corporate career. So I'm wondering what prompted you to start the Cyber5 cyber coaching company.
You bet. That's a great question. So, one of the things over the 11 years that I was with American, and even in my career prior to that, um, I've really continually been involved with security and with understanding the cybersecurity area. In American, because we actually at American, we have America in our name. So the domain for American was americanbus.com. So we saw nation state attacks going back, 5, 6, 7 years from people trying to stick it to that American bus company. So we saw a lot of those attacks, and a distributor in general is really a engine for paying out invoices, right? So your salespeople are working with customers, you're buying the product and you're selling it. So American, if they do 400 million a year in sales, that's probably 300 million a year they're paying in invoices to their vendors. Well, if you think about a business email compromise attack, that's a huge target for a distributorship. So we saw a lot of that exposure, and I worked aggressively throughout my 11 years improving American cybersecurity posture from non-existent to pretty top notch. And it had hit the point in my career where I was ready to go off and do something else, right? So I had a contract, executive contract with American, and we were able to execute that. And I put my second in command, if you will, on my team is now running things at American. I'm on good relations with them. I'm a customer of American. So actually buy my business cards and my merch through them. And then my wife works for him and my son works for him as well. So very good terms. And in fact, I'm partnering with them and a number of other companies as I continue to go after the cyber side. So from my side, I really saw where large businesses like American were getting pretty hardened and we're in a good spot. But very many small businesses and even consumers are really don't have a resource to turn to. It's a little bit, the cybersecurity coaching side is different than a managed service provider, or if you go to Best Buy, you could get the Geek Squad to look at your laptop, right? But they're not going to come in typically and work with you to make sure that you're following all the best password practices, that you're updating your systems regularly. All of those things that make you a juicy target, they're not really looking at because they're just solving the technical needs of your laptop. They might put patches in place and make sure that's going on, and that's a great thing. But I'm really focused more on the security side. So as I've worked with folks, there's some companies that I produce a scorecard and it scores on 5 different vectors. It scores from 0 to 5 on those vectors. And the company I worked with, they started out and their best score was a 1 or a 2. And then I was able to improve that to a 3 or a 4 with all of their vectors. So that's been something that's been rewarding for me because I'm able to still stay in a small town, can still be mayor of my small town, because if I move away, then I'd have to give that up. And at the same time, I still get to do cybersecurity. So that's really been fun.
That's amazing. So tell me more about cybersecurity coaching, right? So is this more for small companies or individuals or large firms? What kind of uh, clients do you have, and who needs cybersecurity coaching in general?
You bet. That's a great question. And I think one of the nice things is it's a very target rich environment. We all need coaching. You just I approach the different customer sets in different ways. So from what I'll call it consumer, or for individuals, they would be ripe for understanding, what are the key ways where they're exposed and how would they improve that to improve their cybersecurity posture. So that's on the consumer side, and that may just be, maybe it is a couple meetings and they get a report and they get some follow-up. So that's a little bit of a smaller engagement. And I would say that's leading edge right now. There's not a lot of folks that recognize they have a need for that, but it's well worth the investment. Typical for a consumer, it might be less than $500 for an engagement. And if you look at the money you have in the bank and the money that you have in your retirement accounts, and those types of things, identity theft and what that might cost you. So it's really a preventative action. So I'm developing that on the consumer market. Then as you move into small businesses, I think they're in that same boat where they may be a lawyer or they may be an accountant or a CPA. They're a rich and juicy target for bad actors, right? Because if you can go after a tax advisor and maybe they just work out of their office and they've got a couple of admins, maybe a small network, and they don't really have a resource to know where they're even exposed. And so I've worked with those folks, and that may be a little bit more of a engagement, but it's very affordable, and it's again focusing on prevention, right? What do you do to make sure that you don't get hacked before it happens? Because really, once you've been hacked or once you went through an identity issue, it's twice as hard to clean it up. It's much better to invest in prevention. And then for larger businesses, that's where focus mainly on a risk assessment platform. So looking at, and even if they may already have an IT shop or they may be contracting with an IT vendor, but I come in as an independent assessment to say how they're doing. So it may come in and it may say, hey, you're doing all the right things. Here's a couple more things to focus on. Or it may be a larger engagement that says, well, you're not really, I've worked with some companies where they're not doing MFA on, multi-factor authentication on their user accounts. And that to me is the number one vector for you're screaming that you want to be attacked, is you don't have multi-factor in place, right? Or you're doing some type of password sharing where you can't really validate somebody's identity because people are logging in with the same user ID from multiple areas, which looks, if you're monitoring your security, that looks like a phishing attack, right? So Riaz, you're based in one area, and all of a sudden you share your username and password with somebody in San Francisco, and they log on. Well, those two logons are very. It looks like a fish, right? It looks like you've lost your credentials because you've given them away, and then some companies are still doing that, and that's one of those things that I can work with them to make sure that we eliminate those bad practices and put good practices in place.
Wonderful. That's great. So it sounds like you serve individuals as well as companies. I hope I understood that correctly. So walk me through it. So let's say I'm an individual. I come to you for cyber coaching. So what difference are you going to make to me um, instead of going to YouTube? I'm sure there are tons of videos that teaches users how to be cyber risk protective or preventative of. So what difference is it going to make doing some self-learning myself, going to a platform like YouTube versus going to a specialist such as yourself? And what are some of the benefits of coming to you instead of doing a self-learning?
You bet. So here's a good example. To me, it's similar to if you went to a fitness center and hired a fitness coach, right? So why would you hire a fitness coach? Because the fitness center has all the machines, it has all the weights. You could go and look on YouTube, or you could read up on how to do it, and maybe you'd be doing it right. But there's some people that their time is more valuable to them than not, and they want to ensure that they are doing it right. So they would hire a fitness coach, and they would meet with that coach occasionally. So that's where that model is analogous to what I would work with on consumers. Is we may have an initial meeting where during that initial interview, I would go through all of the points, understand their practices, what they're doing, and then I would produce a scorecard for them that would say, here's your current posture, right? So based on your current practices, here's what it looks like, here's where you're exposed. And then I would come back a couple weeks later, we would meet again. I would have a report that said, here are the things you probably need to do. It may be in the case of a small office, I may work with their staff to provide cybersecurity awareness training, right? That's a big component of the Cyber Fight 5, if you will, is making sure that your employees know what phishing looks like, that they're aware of, that your help desk, for example, is aware that they're an attack vector. That very many people, and if you look at the MGM attack that happened earlier this year, somebody called in and got the credentials through the help desk for somebody in the MGM organization that had a big access amount, and they were able to leverage that identity and that access to go in and hit the company. So those things, going down the scorecard, making sure that you're following the right practices, and then getting actionable results. So it's really kind of turning it up. Could you do it on your own? Absolutely. Podcasts such as yourself, and there's a lot of them out there. You could go and figure it out all yourself. What I'm really focused on is somebody who doesn't want to learn to be a cybersecurity expert, but they just want to make sure that they're doing the right things. So it's a stress test to understand, are you following the right practices? Are you exposed? I've had some people, and even on our days at American, where my help desk reps I'd be listening to a call, and they would say, they talk to the sales rep, and he'd be like, well, okay, the help desk rep would say, you've got to log on now with your password. And they'd say, well, okay, I try it, and they try it, and it wouldn't work. And they say, oh, well, if it wasn't that one, it must be this one. And they try another one. Say, well, it wasn't those two, it has to be this one because I only have three. It's those types of practices that people don't necessarily understand why they're so bad, because they get exploited by the bad actors. So that's really what I'm going after, is the coaching side, to help and educate folks, and then to get specific with them, whether either a consumer or a business, to say, in your case, here are the three things that you need to do right now where you're most exposed, and here are the things you need to work with going forward. And then we have a checkup probably 6 months into the process, just to see how they've done it. I'm not supplanting any of their IT resources, right? I've talked to some organizations, and they're like, well, I have an IT staff, and I say that's cool, right? In that case, then I may work with the staff to understand how they're doing it. Are they following the best practices? What does their posture look like? And ideally, if we have that initial assessment and it comes back and they're all fives across the board, they're doing everything right, that's good, it's done, right? So it's more of that independent assessment.
Got it. Okay. I think that has its own value, right? Like you said, hiring a coach at a gym example is a great one. Not
Mhm.
many people know how to navigate a new space like this and get the right help. Self help could be hard, so that's where a coach becomes invaluable. That's great. So, what are some of the big mistakes that you see companies or even individuals are doing when it comes to cybersecurity?
Um, I think, to be honest, from that side, one of the big things that companies is they assume that they're anonymous, that they're that they're nothing special. Why would they be attacked, right? When in reality, we're all attacked for the value of our information. Um, there's a good site out there called Krebs on Security. I'm sure you're familiar with Krebs, and he puts out pretty detailed cybersecurity. It's a little bit of inside baseball as far as to the regular consumer, but for IT guys, it's an interesting thing to see. And he'll cover what is the value of an email, right? If you can get, and one that I think a lot of people assume, or they don't really have MFA in place on certain accounts that may be critical, right? Like maybe their Amazon account. They use their Amazon account and they're like, well, yeah, I don't have MFA. It's not a bank and it's not my email. Well, it's actually worse because usually you have your credit cards tied into it, right? And you can deliver product wherever you want to go. So if a bad actor wants to compromise your Amazon account, that's even better because now they can get into Amazon and they can order whatever they want, have it billed to you, and by the time you know about it, you're in that boat. So I think MFA is number one. Putting multi-factor authentication of some type associated with all IDs, eliminating password sharing. I think that's a big one as well. And then the third one, would really be those not making sure that you've got patches on all of your equipment, right? So the updates, and you'll hear a lot of tech people will say patch early, patch often, right? You get those messages pop up on your phone that says, hey, there's a security update, and you say delay or skip it because you don't think you have the time. Those patches, whether it's your phone, whether it's your Windows or your Apple operating system, or whether it's the browser platform that you use, it seems like nowadays Chrome is coming out with a hot patch every other day almost. So making sure that the consumers are aware that these are the ways you keep yourself safe and having that in place. For example, if you say you've got a router that's 6 years old at home, you haven't replaced it, it's an old router, it seems to still work well. Well, any router beyond about 3 years that is off of support, that's at end of life, there's
I didn't
going to
know
be
that. Is it only
vulnerabilities.
3 years? I didn't know. That's too short.
It is very short. It depends on your device, right? But it can be 3 to 5 years. But let's say that the like they had announced a recent vulnerability in Netgear appliance. It was only 3 years old, but the maker had said it's no longer serviceable. It's at end of life, and so at that point they're not issuing the patch. So that if you have that router and you're using that for your home internet, for example, there's no way to make it safe. It's exposed. It's got a vulnerability. The only thing that you would benefit from is if you're remote enough or if you're somewhere where there's not a bad actor that's trying to attack you, but there is no way to make it safe. So it's helping folks understand that, what the best procedures are. And that even goes for your ISPs. Your ISPs could be using uh, an older device, and if you haven't asked for an update or you aren't putting the patches in place, that there could be vulnerabilities there as well. I think it really relates to if you think about cars and automobiles, right? If you bought an automobile and you simply drove it for 100,000 or 200,000 miles, you never changed the oil, you never did any maintenance on it, you didn't rotate your tires, it's going to break somewhere along that chain. There's very few cars that can handle that without understanding the maintenance. Well, we don't necessarily change our own oil anymore. Not a lot of people do, right? Because today, most of your techs plug your car into a computer, and the computer tells the tech what needs to be done, right? It's very computerized, it's very automated. The same thing with our digital appliances, right? Whether that's a laptop that you're using or a phone that you're using, we have extensive and very affordable technology available to us, but we also have a responsibility to make sure that we're using it right, that we're using it properly and securely, because it's just a matter of time, if you're not, until you are going to have some type of issue with that device or with that tool.
Got it. Those are great advices, Mike. So you mentioned multiple times that password sharing is not a good idea, which I agree.
Mhm.
I want to ask you from the context of password sharing tool. Um, Sharing tool, it's actually password tool. It saves your password for you. It's encrypted tool. I use one of them. I don't want to name any companies particularly, but I'm wondering what's your take on these password tools that saves your password off of the browser, off from your phone. How safe are they? And number two, they have password sharing feature as part of their tools feature. Is that feature safe to share passwords amongst users?
So there are a lot of tools out there, right? You may have a password manager. There's three or four that are industry leading. Even Google on the Chrome platform, they do some password management now within the Chrome browser. Those devices are good for a number of reasons. And number one is I think the average now is up to about 200 accounts that we all have if you take into account all of your accounts and passwords that you have somewhere that you've set up. So there's no real way that you're going to remember every one of those. It's beyond what we can do. So by using a password manager, the key thing is when you set it up, when you set that password manager up, is you want to make sure that you're using a never before secure password for the password manager, because the concept is you're going to have one password to remember going forward, and then the password manager will remember all of the other passwords. So if you do that properly, you use a never before used password, and then you turn on multi-factor authentication, right? Because your password manager, when you log in, you think about that. If you lose track of your password manager, right? Somebody gets into your password manager, now they have access to everything. So it's like losing the keys to the kingdom. So you want to make sure it's a unique, never before long password, so you know it's a good password. You turn on multi-factor authentication, and then there's tools within that password manager that help you to control your environment. So I'm a big believer in them. They are, you'll hear every once in a while, you'll see news stories like LastPass had a news story recently that they had a problem. I think all companies out there, and if you go out to, there's a few sites on the internet you can go to that'll show you how often your credentials have been leaked. And I think every company is going to have that. It's not a matter of, well, my ID is clean. If your email account has never been involved in a data breach, it's probably because it's very new, right? When I go to the site that shares how often my accounts have been in a data breach, it's very common. And so the password manager helps you that you can create a long, secure password. It's going to remember it for you. And then the other thing that's key that a lot of people don't think about is some attacks, phishing attacks in particular, they might be sending you a message that says go to Facebook, but they change the C and the E around. So it's not FACE book, it's FAEC book, right? So from to a human, that you're naturally going to transpose those letters in your mind, and you're probably not even going to notice that they're backwards because it looks to your mind, and your mind is very good at correcting misspellings, right? Because we deal with it all the time. So you aren't going to notice it. Well, your password manager knows that that link that it's providing you is not Facebook, and so it won't even offer to put up your Facebook credentials to that site. So the password manager is smart enough and detail orientated enough to know that if there's a bad link, somebody's trying to phish you with a lookalike, we call them lookalike links, that the password manager won't fall for it. So from that standpoint, you'll go to the fake link, assuming you didn't notice it, and you clicked on it, and it's going to say, hey, enter your password. And you're like, well, wait a minute, my password manager is not providing me the credentials. Well, the reason it's not is because it's not Facebook like you thought. So that helps and prevents you as well, because it will also generate unique passwords for you if you want,
Yeah,
and that's a good way to make sure you're not using a password. You can do that, and it's going to generate them and remember them. So overall, they're good tools, assuming you have more than a couple passwords to remember, which we pretty much all do nowadays. I would
absolutely.
love to, Riaz, work to. There's been some movement on passwordless, so moving to whether it's either biometric or something else, but those aren't always necessarily. That's not the golden or the silver bullet that's going to solve everything. So, for example, if say you went to your fingerprints and you want your fingerprints on everything, well, then one of the companies you work with, they had a data breach and they lost your fingerprint image, right? So now how do you change your fingerprints, right? So a bad actor now could, if they got a hold of that biometric, they could have your fingerprints, so they could possibly use them like that. So it's not necessarily a solve all. I think multi-factor authentication takes you 90% of the way there, right? So if you've got an account and you're using just a username and a password, no password alone anymore is really secure, right? So from that standpoint, having the multi-factor authentication, whether you're just using a text message to your phone, that's fallible, that's not perfect, but it's certainly better than not having anything at all, right?
Absolutely. So those are great use cases for using a tool like Password Manager. But what happens if the password manager, that company itself is attacked and their data got leaked? Is that a risk for those who are storing their passwords with that particular password manager tool?
Me, certainly. I mean, anytime you're doing that, you could have a data breach, but then your password manager also can be uh, a benefit to you because it'll help you reassign your passwords, right? So you can go in and understand what the breach was, what was lost, and you can make your change to get that. The other thing is having MFA in place. If somebody gets a hold of your password, but they don't have your multi-factor authentication, you're still pretty safe, right? You can even have a pretty stupid password, 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8, and as long as you've got that MFA device out there that's making sure you are who you are, you're a little bit better. Now, that's also not perfect, right? MFA can be hacked as well. There's a number of instances where folks are exploiting two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication as well. But it's harder, right? So you've got a continuum from easy to hard. And bad guys usually default to easy. They like easy. So the best way for them to find out what your password is to ask you. And that's what they're doing with a phishing message. They're really sending you a link, and maybe the link says, customer RFP, if you don't respond in the next week, you're not going to be able to do the RFP. And so you click on it and it says, okay, this is a secure document. Please enter your Microsoft credentials so you can see it. You enter that information, and now you've just given the bad actor your password, right? So that's the easiest way for a bad actor to get a hold of your password, is to simply ask you what it is, and you tell them. And so in that case, you're your own best enemy. But again, there's the strategies, including multi-factor and different ways to make sure that doesn't happen. To be skeptical as well. I think there's especially in my mother-in-law, for example, I have to tell her all the time, don't click on the Facebook ads, right? It's really hard to tell a Facebook ad from a phishing attack of some sort. And don't trust people. Like if you get a phone call from an unknown number, let it roll to your voicemail, right? You don't, they're not in your phone. You don't know that person. Now, it's harder if you're a business, right? So if you're a business and you have to answer the phone, well, then you do, right? Maybe, or maybe you send it to voicemail and somebody will leave a voicemail and get back to you. But the key thing is be skeptical, right? That's a big part of, and it's happened to me. I've even gotten a call out of the blue where somebody ask you information, and then I realized halfway through the call that this could be a voice phishing attack, right? Or they could be going after something. I know I was always, when I was the CIO at American, I was always intrigued that I would get calls from security companies, right? Out of the blue, they'd call my number. Maybe they found it on LinkedIn or they found it wherever. Our numbers aren't secure anymore. And they would call me wanting to sell me cybersecurity packages or cybersecurity things. And they're calling me from an unknown number out of the blue, and so most of the time I would say, hey, well, my cyber team tells me that I shouldn't talk to you guys. Take my number off your call structure, right? Because, and it's just that interesting dichotomy that a security company who is telling you and warning you about bad actors is now acting like a bad actor by calling you out of the blue to solicit you for phone for services. So yeah, it's a little game of spy versus spy, if you're familiar with that analogy, where they're going after you. They want your information and they're trying to get it from you.
Thank you, Mike. That's very engaging. I'm sure you have some cyber attack stories from your career and profession that you do. I'm wondering if you have any interesting cyber attack stories to share with us today.
You bet. There's a couple. So one that I've done, when I was at American, we publicized that it happened in 2019. I did a couple of sessions on it. It was a 0-day attack against a WebLogic web server. So it was a web server we happened to be using, and the 0 days attacks come in. 0 days are basically exposures that get announced, and there may not even be a patch available yet, right? So it's the 0-day, or it's the first day that the vulnerability is available, and so the bad actors start exploiting that vulnerability. And in this case, they were able to attempt to exploit our WebLogic web server, and then they were doing it also with a 0-day payload, right? So that means that payload that they were trying to put into inject, if you will, into our server wasn't detectable by malware either, because it was a 0-day payload. And so in that process, we were able to find, we monitor our servers, and one of the servers went down, and then another one did, and so we were able to identify that. We had a Go team in place, and that Go team, had a technical lead, communications lead, infrastructure folks. There were 5 folks that were set up to fight that attack. We were able to identify it and isolate it very quickly following the NIST procedures for incident response. And we went right down the line, and within 3 hours, we had recovered from the attack. We had totally purged the environment and restored it from backup. We were up and running and had no data loss. But all of that was done, and we were able to accomplish it because we had done all the proper planning prior to the attack. And so if you tie that back to the cybersecurity coaching, that's why it's so important to look at services that are affordable and reasonable prior to an attack, because the last thing you want to do is to be looking at an attack where you've been hit and now you're trying to secure something that the horse is already out of the barn, if you will. So we had put all the right things in place, and we were lucky in a couple of timing counts, and so we had no data loss and recovered within our metric of RTO, our recovery time objective. We hit it. So, and those are probably two, as you know, Riaz, is 2 metrics that are very important for all companies to understand, but they probably don't, and that's the RTO and the RPO. So an RTO is your recovery time objective. Your RPO is your recovery point objective. So your recovery time objective says once you've declared a disaster, how long until you can have that system up and running in a safe environment or have it restored. And that could be 2 days, it could be 24 hours. In our case, we had it set at 4 hours based on our business purposes, and so we were able to meet that. Your RPO is your recovery point objective. So that says how much data are you subject to lose if you have an attack. At the time, our RPO was 15 minutes. So our backups ran and had to complete within 15 minutes, and it was usually 3 to 5 minutes. And so in that case, we had current backups that we were able to recover without losing any data. So those two metrics are very key. And as your listeners are looking at that, I would challenge them to talk to their IT staff and say, what's our RPO and our RTO? Because a lot of companies don't understand what those metrics are. And frankly, if you don't, then you're really exposed, right? It's like a house if you didn't have fire alarms, right? Hopefully, we all have fire alarms in our house. That's part of your identification metric, right? And so you want to understand what those are and how, if you do have an attack, because a lot of times it's not if anymore, it's when. And when you do have an attack, how long until you can recover from that attack?
That's a very useful piece of information, Mike. Thanks for sharing. So, by the way, between RTO and RPO, is there a industry benchmark that companies should aim for?
It's a good question, and really what it comes down to is what your company, what your senior leaders are willing to tolerate, right? So it becomes very vital to industry metrics. Like for example, a bank who's doing financial transactions, they may have fully redundant systems so that their RPO, they would have virtually no data loss ever, right? But there's a cost for that. Then you have to have the redundant systems. You maybe have a hot array of backups they're always running. So from that standpoint, that may be a high cost. Maybe if you're an HVAC company or you're a business that's not necessarily financial, you may say, okay, we can afford, we're going to use cloud services. And cloud services, a lot of times their metric, the standard for many clouds are 12 hours for their RTO, 12 hours to recover, and 1 hour of data loss. And in that case, like maybe QuickBooks Online, if you're a small business using QuickBooks Online, that might be an acceptable metric for you. Is like, yeah, I could lose an hour's worth of data and I could recover that. If you're a distributor who's processing 40,000 invoices per day, and so then if you do the math on that, you're probably looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 an hour. If you're doing that, you may not be able to tolerate even an hour worth of backup where you'd have to recover that information. So it really comes down to your business. And then the most important thing about your RTO and your RPO is to be able to execute your recovery process in a live environment, right? So if you have a theoretical like, yeah, we can maybe recover within 4 hours and we'll lose no more than 15 minutes of data. And then, if your leadership hasn't said, okay, well, now prove it, right? And you've not done it in a live production environment, I would hate to go into that process, like the attack we experienced in 2019, if we hadn't have already done the recovery, right? Because we had done that. We practiced it at least once a year, and now most companies are doing it quarterly or even monthly, where they're making sure that their backups are good and that they can do the recovery. If that's a known quantity, you're just that much more confident. But it comes down to an individual business choice. A college may have a whole different set of parameters than a bank. And so there is no right or wrong. I would say that it really comes down to what your tolerances are. The more important thing is to know that you have one and
Yep,
that you can execute it, right?
that's a valid point. Thank you, Mike. Um, let's talk about ransomware a little bit. You mentioned backups. So when it comes to protecting against ransomware for companies, um, what kind of measures can companies take to protect themselves against ransomware?
You bet. I think there's probably three main pillars for ransomware response. Well, first of all, and none of them involve getting Bitcoin to pay the bad actor. Okay, so I'll just put that right out there. Doesn't matter what the ransomware is, you should, and I believe the FBI would tell you you should never pay the bad actor. So, what do you need to do to get yourself in that position where you're not going to pay the bad actor? Number one is you have a good backup. Following the 3-2-1 methodology, where you've got 3 copies of the data on 2 different media, or I'm sorry, at least 2 different locations, and one of those is fully offline, right? So, and a lot of people now are using what's called a mutable backup, which means once they copy their backup to their cloud or to where they're putting it, it can't be deleted because bad actors love to go in if they get access to your network and can see what's flying around. They'll try to find where you store your backups and delete the backups, right? Because that's a good way for them to get more leverage on their ransomware threat. So number one is you have a good backup practice and you're following it. Number two is you've tested the recovery, like we've talked about, right? Where you've recovered from backups. I had one company, they had a ransomware attack on a server, but they had Carbonite. So they said, we're good. We just got to restore Carbonite. So they started their restore process on that server, and the Carbonite ticker came up and said, your server will be restored in 13 days and 12 hours. Well, the service that they were paying for on Carbonite was so slow and the amount of data was so large and they'd never tested it before, they were stuck with 14 days to recover that server. So from that standpoint, I don't think if you haven't tested it live, that's going to be a key thing. The second thing, most important thing on ransomware is to have good endpoints in place that are updated. Most really good virus protection software, and an endpoint is simply can be a computer, it can be a phone, any device on your network, any client on your network. It could be a camera, right? A camera could be an endpoint. So any device needs to make sure that it's got good virus protection, and most of the good virus protection nowadays comes with something called EDR, which is endpoint, early detection response. It's basically something that'll pop up if you fire off a phishing attack, for example, that fires off a ransomware executable. That endpoint will come up and it'll say, "Hey, Mike, I see you're trying to encrypt your device right now. Is that something you really want to do?" And so it gives you that checkpoint to say, "Hey, this isn't the usual behavior," right? And so that endpoint will a lot of times prevent the bomb from going off. Those endpoint devices can be on your computers or your phones, but also your servers should have protection as well, whether it's malware protection or some other protection in place to make sure that it's monitoring for ransomware events. And the third thing is education, and that's to make sure that probably most often zero-day attacks are somewhat rare where you would actually get an attack on a 0 day, but the ransomware very commonly comes into your email, right? And that's where we get back to that email we're talking about, where maybe you sent to your the bad actors sent to your Salesforce, here's an RFP, click to respond, time is running out. You've got the message of urgency. They click on it, it comes up, and maybe it doesn't ask for credentials. Maybe it says, click here to download the files, and that fires off the ransomware. Well, if your employee or you, if you're the small business owner, if you hadn't have clicked it, it wouldn't have fired in the first place. So making sure that you're aware of what ransomware, what phishing looks like, um, uh, and that you're aware and actively watching for that. And then you have the endpoint detection. So that gives you the triple protection. You're looking at prevention, that you're recognizing it. You're looking at endpoint detection, which is that double check that says, "Hey, did you really want to fire this off?" And then you've got the third thing, which is the comfort in knowing that you've got a backup that you can restore to if you need to.
Wonderful. Yeah, the backups, endpoints, and education. Education, you made it a very good point. Because a lot of these attacks are social engineering, like the example you gave, right? So the education, that's where it becomes invaluable for the companies and the individuals. It's great. Artificial intelligence is being the buzzword nowadays. So, what do you think about the connection between AI and cybersecurity? I'm asking more so from the standpoint of do you think the risk of cybersecurity will only increase with the advent of AI, or do you think it's going to be the other way?
I think it's going to help both the good actors and the bad actors. And so, if you think about your security operations team, if they are able to use AI, whether you're using Copilot or OpenAI, if they're able to do that, then they can use that agent as a resource for them to understand what this code looks like, what this attack is, maybe what the most recent attacks are, what you're seeing. So it's a good tool, but it's also changed the game for the bad guys, because the bad actors, I guarantee you, whether you're using AI or not, and some businesses have been slow to adopt, the bad actors are using it absolutely. OpenAI offers you a $20 license, and so they're going to feed in. So, for example, we've trained for years around how do you recognize a phishing email? Well, urgency, right? So they're trying to get you to urgent, but we also said look for grammar errors, right? Because grammar errors are common. Um, well, AI can eliminate grammar errors because if I'm a
Very
bad
true.
actor and I put my perspective message in and say, please correct the grammar, it's going to make perfect grammar out of that. So for years, I've always been a disadvocate, if you will, for fish testing. So there's some companies out there that say, we'll fish test your employees and we'll send them fake phishing messages, and then you can understand how often they get fooled. Well, given AI right now, that eliminated that as a good option, right? Because if your AI can't, if you're, because most cybersecurity packages now, if you're taking email, it's all going through an AI infused reader that's reading the message and trying to understand what a fish is and what isn't. Well, if your AI is getting fooled and they don't recognize it as a fish, your employees are also going to get fooled. So for years, I've always taken the tack, I'm not going to fish test you, I'm going to educate you. I don't give you the test before I give you the education. So from that standpoint, I follow at American, we called it the Cyber Minute. I write an article now for a local newspaper, and here in Minnesota, I call it the Cyber Moment. What it is it's I'm giving you the nascent facts of what attacks you might see and how to report them, right? And that gets to be a lot more important to educate your people on real phishing attacks, not fake phishing attacks. I find that the company that sells the fake phishing attack, and they're pretty obvious on which one it is, um, that company, it's a really good way to prove out how well you can write a fish. Because if I write a really good fish, I can trick many of your employees. I can get that number to be 3, 4, 5, 6% maybe. But if I write a poor fish, then everybody's going to recognize it right away. So just by changing the fish test, I can play with the numbers. So it's not really a valid test to me. I think that it's more of a technology. It's a technologist wanting to take the easy way out, right? Here, do a fish test, and then if I fish test my people, well, the other thing you also see, and I've heard more and more of this, is when you do fish test your employees, they have a back channel way of communicating to each other that there's a fish test going on, right? So, they'll see it and they'll say, oh, well, what was the recent one I heard? They said, oh, but they're doing a fish test, and the fish test said something about appropriate attire for working at home, right? So then it had a catch, it had an interesting aspect to it. Well, the person that fell for it the first time, they message all their friends and say, hey, don't fall for this fish. Well, the problem with that is bad actors aren't going to come in through a known vector, right? You can't rely on your folks to tell. One of the things at American that was the most effective for us was a reporting link. So I think at American we called it report it at americanbus.com. And that went it right into me and my full SOC immediately with high priority, and we could see it pop up. So if we had a vendor, for example, that had an email attack where they lost they lost track of, like say we had a lawyer that worked for us, and that lawyer had a phishing attack by one of their admins who communicated with many of the people, and that phishing attack went to numerous employees at our company. Well, there may be a few people that fall for it, but the vast majority are going to realize very quickly, hey, I wasn't working with that admin, or something doesn't make sense, right? The message could have been perfectly written, but the timing was off. That's what your employees can tell you. Well, when they tell you that, you want that to come into that central office to say, okay, we just got to report it from this person and from this person and from this person. Something's going on, right? We're seeing that. And now you can jump into a nascent hot issue and then prevent it from firing off, right? That's the big thing, is it's all about prevention. And even to the point of, when I went to conferences when I was American, I would share our and I think it's still out there, cybersafepledge.americanbus.com. It's a cyber safe pledge that we wanted all of our vendors to take. And what that says is, how do you protect your company, are you using the right tools? Are you doing backups? Are you doing security on your network? You know, it was top 10 questions so that we had an idea of what their maturity level was on the cybersecurity posture, because that's where you see a lot of your attacks come from known people that you're working with, right? Everybody thinks that a phishing attack is going to come from a stranger, and I'll be able to spot it because I know it's. I never dealt with Steve Smith before, and now I'm getting a phishing attack. A phishing attack is probably going to come from your boss, your spouse, somebody you know that's been infected, and their emails using is being used to propagate that attack. So letting your guard down just because you know that person is not a good plan, right? So from that standpoint, I think that's the best thing to watch for. And AI certainly changes the game on that. I think in addition to the actual, I mentioned the tools, most of your, whether it's Sophos or Norton or any of the security tools, they're all using AI to try to identify and to improve their detection methods as well, right? So they can assess your environment with AI tools. It's a game changer, and I think all of us are using it more and more. But it's also not necessarily the be all and end all, right? Because AI can be very easily tricked as well. I mean, it's fallible as well. I mean, there's been times when
Absolutely.
AI, even in your text messages, let's say you're entering a very common message and you misspell a word, but you misspell the first letter, right? You went to type in thanks and you hit Hanks, right? AI is not going to be smart enough usually to know, because it's doing generative tests. It's looking at, if you're trying to spell thanks and you reverse two numbers, it's looking at THA. Well, if it's THN, it realizes, oh, you probably meant thanks. But if it starts with the wrong letter, H, it's thinking you're misspelling Hank or some other
Great
word, right?
example. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Wonderful. Well, Mike, this has been a very educating conversation for me, particularly. I thoroughly enjoyed. I know we're coming to the end of our time here. Before we conclude, I'd like to ask, what business book would you recommend for my audience?
That's a great question. I'm a big Jim Collins fan, so that's the author. Um, if you're going to start with one of his books, Good to Great is a great one to start with. I love the Good Great myth, and then the sequel to that would be Great by Choice. Both of those books, I think, are some of the best understanding business, understanding companies, and modeling good performance to understand how you can achieve that performance as well. The other one, and you only ask for one, but I'll give you a third for free.
Sure,
And that
why not?
is, you can see on Amazon, it's my first 90 days, right? So it's a book out there that talks about if you're in a new role, whether you're in a younger career, um, or if you've been doing it for uh, a longer amount of time, the first 90 days by Michael D. Watkins is a great book to talk about how you structure that first 90 days within a new job or a new career or something that you're doing. So I think those are three that I've used throughout my career, for both. The leadership side on Jim Collins is a good one if you're developing new leaders. That's a good one to follow through on, and even organizationally, you may go after that. And then the other thing I always like, and I use it in city life as well as in my professional life, and that's the Strength Finders books. So Strength Finders is a way to assess what your top strengths are, so that you know and recognize what they are, and understand the strengths of your team, so that you can best prepare to put it out there. So I guess I gave you three instead of one.
And a bonus. That's great. Wonderful, Mike. I actually am familiar with the Jim Collins books and the Strength Finder, but I have not read my first 90 days book. So I'm
Yeah,
interested to read that as well. Last but not
awesome.
the least, where can my audience find more about you
You
or
bet.
connect with you?
LinkedIn is always good. You can find me on LinkedIn. Cyberfife.com will take you right to my Facebook page as well. That covers Cyberfife. I'll link, actually, once you go live with this, I'll make sure to share that on that as well. So those are a couple platforms that I use and have that information available. That's a good way to find me.
Wonderful. Yeah, please send me the link. I'll be sure to include that in the show notes.
Uh,
Once again, Mike, thank you so much for your generous time here. I learned a lot. I'm sure my audience would also feel the same way. We enjoyed the conversation. Appreciate you sharing all those tips and advices for us.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you, Riaz. It's awesome to talk to a fellow CIO, and I love your site and the interviews that you do. I think you're admirable to share that information with our industry. It's a great way to go, and I look forward to working with you more in the future as well.
Wonderful, Mike. Talk to you later. Bye.